I'm not, I'm not denying guilt, and I'm not saying that I'm, as far as anything goes, I don't want to say the wrong thing.
At the end of the day, you need to protect yourself.
Yeah, I don't want to say that I'm guilty or not. I'm just not saying, finding appropriate content at some point, at any point in my life.
Hey friends, it's Katie from Without a Crystal Ball. It's Monday, August 7th, 2023. Let's talk because we have some news from the appeals court in Missouri because Josh Duggar's appeal has been decided by the appeals court. The 3 judges that heard him have denied his appeal and affirm his conviction in the court, which occurred in Springdale, Arkansas. So Josh Duggar will be forced to spend the next 9 years in Seagoville, Texas, unless he gets a change of scenery between now and then. The appeals decision was handed down today, and it is not a very long decision, by the way. And you'll see that much of the decision by the court is in line with basically everything that Judge Brooks in the Federal District Court in Arkansas ruled in this case. So when it comes to Judge Timothy Brooks, he made no mistakes in the decisions that he decided to make, and the previous attempts to have Josh attempt to blame other people is completely put to rest. So let's dive into today's topic. Before we do, can you please do me a big favor and give this video a thumbs up? Also, please subscribe to my channel if you have not yet subscribed by clicking on the subscribe button down below. Click on the bell so you can get notified of any time I go live and new content loads. And if you have something to say, please say it by leaving a comment and share this video with your friends. So there was a couple points that they looked into with this appeal, and the 11-page decision is pretty concise. It's double-spaced, in fact, and I was surprised how little they actually talked because, well, frankly, Josh would have made you believe that he had so many problems with his issue with this case and that his constitutional rights were violated. So they went into a sort of an overview of all of this case. So it says, Duggar used a computer to download hundreds of CSAM images. Law enforcement tracked the images to a used car dealership he owned by identifying the Internet Protocol address of the computer. Not long after, a team of federal agents arrived with a search warrant to walk directly up to Duggar, who pulled out a cell phone and said he wanted to call his attorney. But before he could complete the call, they seized it because it was considered evidence. When asked whether he would like to discuss further details about the warrant, he said yes. Without waiting for an explanation, Duggar blurted out, "What is this about? Has somebody been downloading CSAM?" He then let it slip that he was familiar with file sharing software and had installed it on all of his electronic devices, including the computer in the office. The grand jury indicted Duggar for possessing and receiving. Before trial, he filed a motion to suppress the statements he made at the scene without his lawyer present. The district court denied this motion, concluding that he was not in custody at the time. Those statements took a critical role at trial, and so did the metadata for his iPhone, which placed it at the dealership when the CSAM was downloaded. Duggar, for his part, tried to point the finger elsewhere, looking to convince the jury that it faced a classic old-fashioned whodunit. He suggested that a former employee who happened to be a convicted SO was to blame. Duggar ultimately decided not to call him to the stand, however, because the district court ruled that any mention of the employer's prior conviction was off limits. The jury found him guilty as charged. After entering a judgment on the receipt CSAM, the district court sentenced him to 151 months in prison. He now believes the district court's decision to stop him from asking about the employee's prior SO deprived him of his right to present a complete defense. So they go into the 3 different issues that we're going to cover in this appeal. 1, not being able to call Caleb Williams. 2, whether or not he was in custody. And 3, was James Futrell, who was the forensic individual for the U.S. attorney for the U.S. government that worked for the Department of Justice, if he was qualified to discuss metadata. So with the metadata issue, he was totally qualified. But when it comes to Caleb Williams. So we start with the Caleb Williams situation where Josh claims that they wouldn't let him call him, but really it had nothing to do with that. He wasn't allowed to ask about the SO status because the judge in the case said that that would confuse the jury. And they said that they could ask Caleb questions, but they couldn't go into his offenses because it would confuse the jury. They said that the court had unquestionable constitutional discretion to exclude the conviction under the Rule of Evidence 403, and that it follows the court's application of this well-established rule that could not have violated his Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights, and basically that they were allowed under the rules to exclude Caleb Williams. They were allowed to not include his SO status, and that was permissible. And so the court did nothing wrong there. A minor mistake that Judge Brooks made in chambers, which was later corrected, they said was harmless and proved that there literally was no other issues because they claimed that it mentioned the strength of the prosecution's case as a factor weighing against the admission of the alternative perpetrator evidence. That was later corrected to the weakness of his evidence of Caleb being there. And so they basically just said that it would have provided speculation and they were valid reasons for limiting his alternative perpetrator evidence. He had no evidence Caleb was there, and that was it. So they can't point the finger at Caleb because they have literally no proof he was there. So when it comes to him being at the car lot, one of the issues was Josh is trying to say that he was literally in custody and that, he gave these statements and he wanted to speak to his counsel and he was denied the right to speak to his counsel. So a right to counsel only happens after someone is in custody. And so Josh exerted that he wanted to speak to his attorney, but in order to exert that you can speak to your attorney, you have to be in custody, and Josh was not in custody. And so they go through some of the reasons why Josh was not in custody, and here's what they said. The first factor is the most obvious, and it's that when the agents arrived, they told him that a federal search warrant, not an arrest warrant, that he was free to leave if he chose to do so. Later, when the agents invited him to speak with him, they reiterated that he had a right to stop the questioning at any time, and in other words, they clearly informed him that he was free to leave and decline questioning. It's true that the agents read him Miranda rights, which ordinarily might leave someone with the impression that they are in custody. But when Duggar signed a form acknowledging that he then had the agents scratch out the portion saying that he was being taken into custody, modifying the form to make clear he was free to leave. The second and third factors were also in favor of the government. Duggar sat in the front passenger seat of the agent's truck during the interview. They did not handcuff him. The doors remained unlocked, and he entered and exited the front seat of the vehicle on his own, which means that he was able to retain freedom of movement throughout the encounter. He began the interview with a question of his own: has somebody been downloading CSAM? And continued to converse with them for about an hour. The fourth and fifth, it says they don't move the needle much further in either direction. It's true that the agents failed to follow through on their promise to alert Duggar's lawyer to the search. Even so, it would not have prevented a reasonable person from terminating an interview. And nor does the fact that law enforcement assumed control of the dealership necessarily mean the interview was police dominated, at least not here. When Duggar and the agents were engaged in consensual two-way questioning, they basically said it was going back and forth. He was not arrested at the termination of questioning, and to the contrary, he ended the interview on his own and left the dealership hardly an option available to someone in custody. A reasonable person in Duggar's position would have not have thought his freedom to movement was restricted. It follows the admission the statements did not violate Miranda. So basically, he was free to leave and he wasn't in custody. They didn't arrest him. They followed all the protocols. And Josh basically just wants his statements thrown out because in his statements, he basically admitted that he had all these peer-to-peer networks on all of his computers. He also made statements about, did somebody download CSAM? And he also said things like, I'm not going to say that I'm guilty. I'm not going to not say I'm guilty. I'm not going to deny my guilt, he said. And he just throughout, did somebody upload and download? I want to know. He just kept asking a lot of questions that incriminated him. And those statements, the jury actually asked to listen to his interview once while they were in deliberations. And then when it comes to the metadata, he's trying to say that their expert, James Fitrell, did not have the expertise to understand how to read metadata. and that they were upset that his expert couldn't testify about her knowledge about the metadata, even though she never even remotely tried to look at the metadata. They go into how Futrell actually looked at the metadata, how he was able to find the coordinates. He didn't need to have, it says using metadata didn't necessarily require that he had scientific knowledge of what he was doing, but they said that he had examined thousands of electronic devices and written hundreds of forensic reports, many of which involved the analysis of metadata. Even though he didn't have specialized knowledge in this area, they deemed him an expert, and that it's not a scientific process, and not all forensic work is scientific, and so therefore you don't need to be like an expert. His methods were reliably applied. He examined photographs himself, then he put the GPS coordinates into the online map, and all of those different things put the photos at the car lot, and he even double checked his work before reaching a conclusion. So he didn't abuse his discretion. And then as far as like his expert not being allowed to testify about the metadata, it says the same goes for the limitations on what Duggar's expert would say. Although the district court allowed her to speak generally about the metadata, she could not suggest that the dates and times were wrong because she never loaded any of it onto her software. So as to put it, her testimony consisted of a lot of I don't knows. It was not an abuse of discretion to limit her testimony to what she knew. After all, it would have been pure conjecture for her to suggest that there were errors in metadata she never examined. It does not matter that the government cross-examined her about the EXIF timestamps on the photograph. She responded by assuming the information in the government's exhibit was accurate because she had not personally verified it. Given that qualification, she did not leave the jury with the false impression that she agreed with the government's analysis. There was, in other words, nothing for her to clarify. She didn't examine it herself, she didn't load it herself, and so therefore she couldn't testify. So James Futrell was qualified to do it. He took all the steps necessary to analyze it. The people that analyzed it for forensics analyzed it, and they were able to do it. His expert never took the time to look at the metadata, so she wasn't denied the right to speak about it, and so they said his judgment of the district court is affirmed. So his conviction is not going to be overturned, and all of his excuses of it was Caleb Williams' fault, I wasn't in custody, I want to speak to my lawyer, all of it falls flat. I knew that this appeal would go nowhere. And he does have a right for an appeal to an appeal. I don't really know, but a letter says that if the Court of Appeals is adverse to the defendant in a whole or in part, the duty of counsel. So basically, they can advise the defendant. His attorneys are supposed to advise the defendant of his right to file a petition for a panel rehearing, and a petition for rehearing in bank in the Court of Appeals, and a petition to writ certiorari in the Supreme Court of the United States, informing the defendant of counsel's opinion as to the merit and likelihood of the success of these petitions. If the defendant requests counsel file any of those, they must be filed in X amount of days under federal rules of procedure. So he can file a writ for the Supreme Court to look at this. He can also request a rehearing, but this seems pretty straightforward, and I wouldn't doubt that he'll do that. I'm sure he has no chance of any of this being reheard, but Josh seems like he wants to waste time in the appeals court, and he might just do it for the sake of doing it. But yeah, his appeal was denied. He will be in prison until 2032, and even with a rehearing and going to the Supreme Court, they're not going to overturn this. So Josh Duggar loses big. Anna Duggar is going to have to figure out what she's going to do because Josh is not coming home anytime soon. This is great news for those of you and me who've been covering this story for a long time to know that Josh will not be a free man until at least 2032. Tell me what your thoughts are in the comments below. Bye, guys.